The morning began with the quiet hum of the city and the even quieter sound of Ben arguing with his coffee machine. The machine had always behaved like a suspicious alien artifact. Some mornings it produced excellent coffee. Other mornings it emitted noises that sounded like philosophical disagreement. Today it simply blinked at him with stubborn silence. Ben leaned over it with the patience of a man who had survived 5 years of strange circumstances. "Listen," he told the machine. "We both know you can do this." The machine continued blinking. From the kitchen table, Sera watched the exchange while slowly turning a page of the old tablet she was reading. Her long ears twitched slightly. A movement Ben had learned meant she was quietly amused. "You realize," she said calmly, "you are negotiating with a device that does not possess language comprehension." Ben crossed his arms. "That's what it wants you to believe." Sera smiled faintly. After 5 years living together in a cramped apartment above a noodle shop, she had grown used to Ben's particular way of approaching problems. He believed every machine could be reasoned with, and every situation could be improved by making sarcastic comments at it. Sometimes, embarrassingly often, it even worked. Outside the window, the morning sky carried the faint shimmer of orbital traffic lanes. Small cargo shuttles moved between Earth's upper atmosphere and the scattered trade stations hanging above the planet. The world had grown used to that sight decades ago. Interstellar visitors passed through the system often enough that the presence of alien ships rarely caused more excitement than a delayed subway train. Sera glanced at them occasionally, but she never stared for long. Ben finally pressed the coffee machine's reset panel with theatrical determination. The machine whirred. Steam rose. A single cup of coffee appeared. Ben raised both hands in triumph. "Victory, Kanachuri," he announced. "You pressed the reset button," Sera said. "Victory through strategy." She returned her attention to the tablet, though her smile remained. 5 years earlier, she had arrived at the apartment carrying one small suitcase and a story that sounded almost deliberately vague. She had explained that she was starting over after leaving a complicated situation far away. Ben had accepted that explanation without interrogation, mostly because the rent was cheaper if shared, and because her long ears were not the strangest thing he had seen in the city. In a world where 3 different alien species ran noodle restaurants on the same street, unusual anatomy barely ranked as a conversation topic. Still, Sera had always seemed slightly different from everyone else. Not strange, just composed. Even when the smoke alarm activated during Ben's attempt to cook something he described as experimental chili, she had calmly opened the windows and suggested perhaps less experimentation with fire. Now she sipped tea from a chipped mug while reading the news. Ben sat across from her, drinking his coffee and scrolling through job listings. "Did you know," he said suddenly, "there's a job repairing atmospheric drones on Mars? Good pay. Terrible gravity." Sera tilted her head slightly. "You dislike low-gravity environments." "I fall over," Ben said. "That is not a standard occupational hazard. It becomes one when your dignity collapses." The apartment was quiet again after that, filled only with the distant sound of city traffic and the occasional passing shuttle. Then something tapped against the front door. Ben frowned. "That's new." They both looked toward the entrance. A soft mechanical hum followed, precise and polite, the kind of sound expensive delivery drones usually made when approaching a destination. Ben stood up slowly. "I didn't order anything." Sera had gone completely still. He noticed that immediately. In 5 years, he had never seen her react like that to something as ordinary as a delivery. The tapping came again. Ben opened the door. Floating outside was a sleek courier drone shaped like a polished silver disc. Its surface carried faint glowing symbols arranged in an intricate crest Ben didn't recognize. The drone extended a small compartment. Inside rested a single envelope. The paper itself shimmered faintly with embedded light patterns, the kind usually used by high-level diplomatic systems. Ben stared. "Well," he said slowly, "either we accidentally joined interstellar politics, or someone ordered very fancy mail." He turned and handed the envelope to Sera. For a moment she didn't move. Then she accepted it. The moment her fingers touched the seal, the crest glowed brighter, responding to some unseen recognition protocol. Ben watched her face carefully. Sera opened the letter. Her eyes moved across the page once, then again. The calm expression she always carried shifted into something far more complicated. Not fear, not surprise, something heavier. Ben leaned forward. Okay, he said carefully. That reaction usually means either bad news or surprise royalty. Sera slowly lowered the letter. She looked at the tiny apartment around them, the crooked shelves, the old couch, the stubborn coffee machine. Then she looked at Ben. Her voice came out quiet. It appears, she said, that my counsel has finally located me. Ben blinked. He waited a moment, then another. You're what? Ben waited for the rest of the explanation, the same way someone waits for the punchline of a joke they are not entirely sure is a joke. Sera remained quiet. The small envelope rested on the table between them, glowing faintly as if it knew it had just caused serious disruption to a peaceful morning. Ben cleared his throat. Your counsel, he repeated slowly, pointing at the letter like it might suddenly explode into a parade of diplomats. Yes. Your counsel as in the committee that decides apartment laundry schedules? Sera gave him a look. No. Your counsel as in community club? No. Ben leaned back in his chair. Your counsel as in the thing people usually have when they rule a nation. Sera folded the letter carefully. Yes. Ben stared at her for several seconds. Then he looked around the kitchen, as if checking whether hidden cameras were about to appear. You're joking? I rarely joke about constitutional matters. That sentence alone is worrying. Sera placed the letter on the table. The crest on the paper dimmed now that it had completed whatever dramatic mission it had been sent to accomplish. Ben rubbed his face slowly. Okay, he said. Let's go through this carefully. 5 years ago, you arrived here with one suitcase and told me you were starting a new life. That part was true. You said you were a refugee. That was also technically true. You did not mention ruling a star system. That part seemed unnecessarily complicated for an introduction. Ben leaned back in his chair again and looked at the ceiling. Of course, he muttered. Why would someone casually mention being galactic royalty during a roommate interview? Sera's long ears twitched slightly. It would have created awkward expectations. You think? She sighed softly. My full name is Seraphina Valeris. Ben pointed at her. See? That sounds important. That is not a name someone with unpaid parking tickets has. I have had parking tickets. Not the point. He leaned forward again, staring at her like someone trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly grown 10 new pieces. So let me understand this correctly, he said. You are telling me that for the last 5 years, yes, I have been living with an alien queen. Yes. And the most suspicious thing about you was the time you forgot to pay the electricity bill. That was your responsibility. That is not the issue right now. Sera folded her hands calmly. I did not intend for the situation to remain secret this long. Ben looked at the letter again. So this council, he said slowly, they're from where exactly? The Lyran Dominion. That sounds very official. It is. How many planets? 7 primary systems. Ben froze. 7. Yes. And you rule them. Yes. Ben sat very still for several seconds. Then he picked up his coffee cup and drank from it slowly, as if hoping caffeine might help him process the universe more efficiently. It did not. You know, he said finally, I once complained about the neighbor playing loud music at 2 in the morning. Yes. You nodded politely. Yes. And during that conversation, you were secretly responsible for governing multiple star systems. That problem did not fall within my jurisdiction. Ben pointed at her again. That joke suggests you are taking this very calmly. I have had 5 years to get used to the situation. You mean hiding from it? Sera's gaze softened slightly. Yes. Ben studied her face. For 5 years, he had known her as the quiet woman who shared rent, occasionally stole his snacks, and possessed an alarming ability to win every board game they played. Now his brain was trying to rearrange those memories into something compatible with the phrase, galactic monarch. Why Earth? He asked. Sera leaned back in her chair. Because no one here takes royalty seriously. That is extremely fair. When I arrived, she continued, my empire was experiencing complications. That sounds like a polite word for chaos. It was, she paused. There was a succession crisis. Political factions began forming. Several individuals believed they would perform my job more effectively. Ben nodded slowly. In my experience, and he said, those are usually the people who absolutely should not have the job. Correct. So you ran. I relocated. You ran. Sera smiled faintly. I left quietly. Ben considered that. And you ended up living in my apartment. You were the only person who did not ask strange questions? That's because you paid rent on time. An excellent diplomatic strategy. Ben laughed despite himself. The absurdity of the situation was beginning to settle into something almost manageable. Almost. So this letter, he said, tapping the envelope again, what exactly does your counsel want? Sera unfolded it once more. Her eyes moved across the lines again, slower this time. They have located me. Yes, that part we established. They are coming to retrieve me. Ben blinked. Retrieve. Yes, like a package. More ceremonially. When? Sera looked at the final line. Soon? Ben leaned back in his chair again. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he looked at her. So let me summarize our morning, he said. I woke up, fought a coffee machine, and discovered my roommate is the missing queen of an interstellar empire whose government is currently on its way here. Sera nodded politely. That is an accurate summary. Ben sighed. You know, he said, I had plans today. What kind of plans? I was going to clean the kitchen. That can wait. Yes, Ben said. I feel like galactic politics might slightly outrank the dishes. Ben spent the next hour doing what any reasonable person would do after discovering his roommate secretly ruled several planets. He opened every public database he could find and began researching the Lyran Dominion. The apartment had become unusually quiet. Sera sat near the window with a cup of tea, watching the city below. She looked calm, but Ben noticed the way her long ears occasionally twitched whenever a shuttle passed overhead. It was a small sign of tension he had never noticed before. Ben scrolled through a galactic information archive on his tablet. This can't be right, he muttered. Sera glanced at him. What is incorrect? Ben turned the tablet toward her. A holographic map floated above the screen, displaying several star systems connected by glowing trade routes. 7 systems, Ben said. 212 inhabited planets and colonies. That is approximately correct. Approximately. Yes. Ben leaned back in his chair. I thought you meant 7 planets. That would be a very small dominion. I am starting to understand that. He stared at the holographic display again. The dominion was enormous. Fleets of starships, mining worlds, diplomatic stations, entire civilizations operating under one political structure. And for 5 years, the person responsible for governing all of it had been sitting across from him, complaining about broken kitchen appliances. Ben rubbed his temples. This is deeply upsetting. Sera raised an eyebrow. Why? Because last month you asked me how to reset the Wi-Fi router. It was confusing. You command faster than light fleets. That is unrelated. Ben stared at her. It absolutely feels related. Sera smiled faintly and returned her gaze to the window. Outside, the city moved through its usual rhythm. Delivery drones zipped between buildings, sky buses glided along traffic lanes, and distant orbital elevators rose into the upper atmosphere like silver threads. To anyone else, the morning was perfectly ordinary. Ben, however, had learned something important about ordinary mornings. They could collapse without warning. He looked back at the tablet. Your empire has living starships. Yes, living. They are bioengineered vessels grown from adaptive alloys. Ben stared. So they're alive, in a limited sense. And you were impressed when my smart refrigerator suggested a grocery list. That refrigerator was surprisingly intelligent. Ben groaned and leaned back again. I have been accidentally explaining Earth technology to someone who commands living starships. You were very enthusiastic about the refrigerator. That's because it can detect when milk goes bad. Sera tilted her head thoughtfully. That is genuinely useful. Ben lowered the tablet slowly. You're doing it again. Doing what? Acting like ruling an interstellar civilization is less impressive than kitchen appliances. Sera didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched a cargo shuttle rise slowly into the sky. I spent most of my life surrounded by technology far more advanced than anything here, she said quietly. Ben waited, but none of it ever made me laugh the way that refrigerator did. Ben blinked. That is possibly the strangest compliment Earth technology has ever received. She smiled again. The moment lasted only a few seconds before the tablet beeped. Ben glanced down. A news alert had appeared. He frowned. That's odd. What is? There's an unidentified object entering Earth orbit. Sera turned toward him slowly. Ben enlarged the display. A small icon appeared above the planet, moving silently through the outer defense grid. Orbital authorities were already tracking it. Unknown vessel detected, the report read. No hostile intent registered. Craft broadcasting diplomatic codes. Ben squinted at the information. Diplomatic codes, he said. Sera leaned forward slightly. What system? Ben opened the signal details. A crest appeared, the same crest that had been glowing on the letter. Ben slowly looked up. Oh, Sera sighed. That was faster than expected. Ben stared at the screen again. The ship was enormous. Not aggressive, not armored like a warship, but elegant in a way that made human spacecraft look like awkward machinery. Its structure curved smoothly like something grown rather than built. The ship drifted silently above Earth. Ben swallowed. So your council travels in that? Yes. That is not a shuttle. No. That is a palace. Essentially, Ben leaned back again. This day continues to escalate. Sera stood up and walked toward the window. High above the clouds, the faint silver outline of the ship was just barely visible against the blue sky. For several seconds, she said nothing. Ben watched her carefully. You knew this would happen eventually, he said. Yes. You were just hoping it would take longer. Yes. He scratched his head. I have a question. You have many questions. Important one. She looked back at him. What happens when your council gets here? Sera considered the answer carefully. They will request that I return. And if you say no, they will request more persuasively. Ben nodded slowly. That sounds diplomatic. It is. He looked at the tablet again. Traffic around the orbital station was already being redirected to give the alien vessel space. Earth authorities were clearly nervous. Ben leaned forward. So, small detail. Yes? When representatives from a 7-system empire arrive at our apartment? Yes? Should I clean the kitchen first? Sera looked around the messy room, the crooked shelves, the old couch, the stubborn coffee machine blinking quietly on the counter. She laughed softly. I believe, she said, they will survive the experience. Ben nodded. Good. He paused. Because the dishes are definitely still your turn. The city noticed the ship before the authorities finished pretending nothing unusual was happening. Ben learned this the moment his tablet began vibrating, like it had suddenly developed anxiety. Every news channel displayed the same image. A massive silver structure resting quietly in Earth's orbit. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't maneuvering. It simply hovered there with the calm confidence of something that knew it belonged. Ben stared at the screen. That, he said slowly, is not subtle. Sera stood beside the window, arms crossed loosely. Her long ears tilted slightly as she observed the distant glow of the vessel above the atmosphere. No, she agreed. It's about the size of a city. It houses my council. Of course it does. Ben zoomed in on the news feed. Analysts were already speculating wildly. Some thought it was a diplomatic delegation. Others believed it was a new form of trade vessel. One extremely dramatic commentator suggested it might be the beginning of an alien invasion, though the lack of visible weapons slightly weakened that theory. Ben lowered the tablet and looked at Sera. You know what the interesting part is? What? You're not surprised. I told you they were coming. Yes, but I assumed something slightly smaller. Sera tilted her head. That is a small ship. Ben blinked. What? It is primarily for diplomatic travel. That thing could hold a football stadium. It can. Ben sat down slowly. I feel like my understanding of scale is being damaged today. Sera returned to the table and picked up the letter again. reading it more carefully this time. Ben watched her. For 5 years she had been calm about nearly everything. Burnt food, broken appliances, strange landlords. Nothing ever seemed to rattle her. But now there was something different in the way she held the letter. Not fear, not excitement, something heavier, responsibility. Ben cleared his throat. So, hypothetical question. Yes? If your counsel comes down here, what exactly happens? They will request an audience. With you? Yes. In our apartment? Yes. Ben looked around the room. The couch had a mysterious stain from an incident involving spicy noodles and gravity. 3 empty snack containers sat on the table. The coffee machine blinked quietly like a witness to chaos. Ben pointed at the kitchen. I feel like interstellar diplomacy might expect slightly cleaner surroundings. They will survive. That is a strong assumption. Sera smiled faintly. They once held a meeting inside a volcanic station on a mining world. Ben paused. Okay, the couch stain is probably fine then. A soft chime interrupted them. Ben looked at the tablet again. A new alert appeared. Orbital traffic temporarily restricted. Unidentified vessel requesting diplomatic landing clearance. Ben looked up slowly. They're asking permission. That is polite. They're already bigger than half the orbital station. Still polite. Ben exhaled slowly. So Earth is currently negotiating landing rights with your political advisors. Yes. You're taking this remarkably well. I have had practice. Ben leaned back and studied her face again. Something about the situation finally clicked in his mind. You knew this day would come. Yes. You just hoped it wouldn't. She didn't answer immediately. Outside, the ship shifted slightly in orbit. The movement was slow and graceful, like a giant sea creature adjusting its position in invisible water. Finally, Sera spoke. I did not expect to stay away this long. Ben nodded. 5 years. Yes. That's not exactly a vacation. No. You built a life here. Yes. Ben gestured around the apartment. A very glamorous life. Sera laughed quietly. That is part of why I stayed. Ben looked confused. The glamour? The simplicity. She picked up the chipped mug beside her. This cup costs 2 credits. Less if it's on sale. In my palace, she said, a cup like this would be part of a ceremonial tea service designed by 4 different artisans. Ben stared at the mug. It has a crack. I like the crack. He leaned back again, trying to absorb the absurd contrast. You escaped from ruling an empire, he said, and discovered the joy of cheap kitchenware. Yes, Ben nodded slowly. That might be the most relatable royal decision in history. Another alert chimed. Ben glanced at the tablet. Landing clearance approved. He froze. Sera looked up. What does it say? Ben read the message carefully. Diplomatic shuttle descending? He looked at the window. Far above the city, a small shape detached from the enormous ship. Small, of course, was relative. The shuttle was roughly the size of a passenger aircraft. It moved silently through the atmosphere, glowing softly as it descended. Ben swallowed. That's them. Yes. They're really coming here. Yes. He stood up and looked around the apartment again. The crooked shelves, the snack containers, the stubborn coffee machine. Ben sighed. Well, he said, yes? I guess we should at least pretend to be respectable. Sera tilted her head. How? Ben grabbed the snack containers and stacked them quickly. He wiped the table with a cloth that had questionable cleaning credentials. Then he looked at the couch. The stains stared back at him like a historical monument. Ben sighed again. Okay, he said. Maybe respectable is unrealistic. Sera smiled. The distant sound of atmospheric engines rumbled faintly through the air. The council was arriving. Ben took a deep breath. You know, he said carefully, most people meet royalty at a palace. Yes, I'm meeting them next to a broken coffee machine. That machine won this morning's negotiation. Ben nodded. That's true. He paused. Do you think they'll notice the dishes? Sera looked at the sink. Then she looked back at him. Yes. The shuttle arrived with far less drama than Ben expected. There were no explosions of light, no thunderous engines shaking the city, and no intimidating fleet formations hovering over the skyline. Instead, the craft descended quietly between the buildings, like a patient bird that knew exactly where it intended to land. Ben stood at the apartment window watching the news feeds update every few seconds. Authorities had cleared an entire landing zone 3 blocks away. Emergency drones hovered nearby, recording everything. A crowd had already gathered. Of course they had. Human beings, Ben reflected, had a remarkable ability to turn historic diplomatic events into street festivals. He looked over his shoulder at Sera. She stood near the kitchen table, calm as always, but the stillness in her posture suggested she was thinking very carefully. The shuttle's silhouette glided down through the morning haze and touched the landing platform with quiet precision. Ben let out a low whistle. That thing costs more than this entire neighborhood. That is likely accurate, Sera said. He stared out the window again. The vessel's surface shimmered faintly, its hull formed from some living alloy that seemed to breathe with soft pulses of light. The design wasn't aggressive or militaristic. It looked elegant, almost ceremonial. Your people really like dramatic entrances, Ben said. That was a modest arrival. Modest? Yes. Ben turned around and leaned against the wall. I would hate to see what you consider dramatic. Sera's long ears twitched slightly. You once attempted to cook chili using experimental spices. That was a dramatic event. You triggered 3 smoke alarms. That was a technical malfunction. Before Sera could respond, Ben's tablet chimed again. He glanced at the screen. They're leaving the shuttle. He tapped the display and a live drone camera feed expanded above the tablet. 3 figures stepped out of the vessel. They were tall, taller than most humans, and carried themselves with the effortless precision of people trained to operate in formal environments. Their clothing shimmered with subtle energy patterns that shifted with every movement. The fabric looked less like cloth and more like controlled light woven into shape. Each of them had long ears like Sera. Ben stared. Well, he said quietly, family resemblance confirmed. Sera crossed the room and looked at the screen beside him. The figures paused briefly while Earth's diplomatic representatives approached them. Even through the drone footage, Ben could tell the atmosphere was tense. Human officials spoke carefully, maintaining polite smiles while attempting to look as though giant alien delegations arriving unannounced was a routine administrative matter. The tallest member of Sera's council nodded politely and said something to the officials. A translator drone hovering nearby converted the alien speech into Earth standard. We request permission to meet Her Majesty. Ben froze. He slowly turned his head towards Sera. They just said Her Majesty. Yes. You realize they said that out loud in front of about 50 government officials. Yes. Ben leaned forward and increased the volume. The translator drone continued. Queen Seraphina Valaris of the Lyran Dominion has been located on this planet. We request a private audience. The human representatives exchanged nervous looks. One of them cleared his throat. Our authorities would appreciate clarification regarding the presence of a foreign monarch currently residing within our jurisdiction. The alien advisor tilted his head slightly. Our queen has been residing here voluntarily. Ben rubbed his face. Voluntarily? Sera folded her arms. That part is accurate. Ben pointed at the tablet. They're about to discover you've been living above a noodle shop. That establishment has excellent soup. The conversation on the drone feed continued. Finally, one of the human diplomats nodded and gestured toward the street. Very well, he said carefully. We will escort you. Ben watched the council members begin walking down the street. Pedestrians had gathered along the sidewalks, whispering and recording everything on their devices. Children pointed excitedly at the visitors. One brave street vendor attempted to sell them grilled snacks. The alien council politely declined. Ben stared at the scene. They're coming here. Yes. In person. Yes. To our apartment. Yes. Ben slowly looked around the room again. The crooked shelves, the couch with the suspicious stain, the pile of dishes in the sink. He exhaled. You know, he said, this place suddenly feels historically important. Sera smiled. History is often made in ordinary places. Ben considered that. Then he glanced at the coffee machine. The machine blinked calmly. You hear that? Ben told it. You're part of galactic history now. The machine blinked again. Sera laughed quietly. A few minutes later, another notification appeared on Ben's tablet. Security cameras from the street activated automatically. Ben opened the feed. Three tall figures were walking toward the apartment building. Behind them trailed a small group of nervous Earth officials. Ben swallowed. "They're 2 blocks away." Sera nodded. They walked quickly. Ben paced the room. "Okay," he said. "We need a plan." "What kind of plan?" "I don't know. Something respectful." "You have been speaking to me disrespectfully for 5 years. That was before I knew you ruled several star systems." "I did not object." "That's because you were hiding." Sera tilted her head. "Perhaps I simply enjoyed being treated normally." Ben stopped pacing. That sentence lingered in the room for a moment. Then the building's front door chimed. Ben froze. Another chime followed. The elevator activated downstairs. Ben looked at Sera. "They're here." Sera nodded slowly. Ben took a deep breath. "Well," he said. "Yes? I guess we're about to meet your government." The elevator in Ben's building had always been slow, not slightly slow, philosophically slow. It moved between floors with the thoughtful patience of a machine that believed life should not be rushed. Under normal circumstances, this was merely annoying. On this particular morning, it became deeply dramatic. Ben stood in the middle of the apartment, staring at the door while the elevator crept upward somewhere below them. He could hear the faint mechanical whir echoing through the hallway. "That," he said quietly, "is the slowest diplomatic arrival in the history of interstellar politics." Sera remained calm. "They are patient people. They're about to meet the apartment with the crooked bookshelf. They will survive." Ben looked at the bookshelf. One of the legs was supported by a stack of old magazines. "Will they?" The elevator continued climbing. Floor 2. Pause. Floor 3. Pause. Ben began pacing. "Okay," he said. "Quick question." Sera watched him. "What?" "When your counsel greets you, what do they usually do?" "They bow." Ben froze. "They bow." "Yes." "Like royal bowing." "Yes." Ben looked around the apartment again. The crooked shelves, the cracked mug, the coffee machine blinking like a suspicious observer. "They're going to bow to you next to that coffee machine. That machine has shown impressive determination. That machine lost an argument with a toaster last week." Sera smiled faintly. The elevator reached their floor with a soft mechanical sigh. Ben immediately stopped pacing. Both of them looked toward the hallway. Footsteps followed, several pairs. Measured, calm, deliberate. Ben suddenly realized he was nervous. Not about aliens, not about diplomacy, but about something far stranger. For 5 years, Sera had been his roommate. Now she was about to become something else. The knock on the door was gentle. 3 precise taps. Ben glanced at Sera. "You want to get that? You live here." "That feels like a technicality." Sera walked past him and opened the door. The hallway outside contained 3 tall figures. Their presence filled the narrow space immediately. Their clothing shimmered softly, delicate energy patterns shifting across the fabric like living constellations. Each of them had long ears like Sera's. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then the tallest of them stepped forward. The instant his eyes met Sera's, he lowered his head deeply. The other 2 followed. All 3 bowed. The movement was precise and ceremonial. The narrow hallway suddenly felt like a royal chamber. Ben stood behind Sera, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. The tallest advisor spoke. "Your Majesty." The translator device on his collar converted the words into Earth Standard instantly. "We have searched many worlds." Sera stood quietly. "You found me." "Yes." The advisor straightened slowly. His eyes moved briefly past her. He looked inside the apartment. The crooked shelves, the old couch, the blinking coffee machine. The advisor blinked once. Ben coughed awkwardly. "Welcome," he said. All 3 advisors turned toward him at the same time. Ben immediately regretted speaking. The tallest advisor studied him carefully. "And you are?" Ben hesitated. "I am the roommate." The advisors exchanged a brief glance. One of them tilted his head. "You have been residing with Her Majesty?" "Yes." "For 5 cycles?" "Yes." The advisor nodded slowly, clearly processing this information. Ben felt the need to explain something. "In my defense," he said quickly, "I did not know she was a queen." The second advisor spoke quietly. That is understandable. Ben relaxed slightly. Good, the advisor continued. Her Majesty has always preferred unconventional solutions. Ben looked at Sera. That sounds accurate. Sera crossed her arms lightly. You have come a long way. Yes, the first advisor said. The Dominion requires its queen. Silence settled in the room. Even the coffee machine seemed to stop blinking. Ben suddenly became very aware that the tiny apartment now contained representatives of a seven-system empire. The advisor spoke again. The political situation has stabilized. That is good to hear. However, your presence is necessary. Sera did not respond immediately. Ben noticed the advisors watching her carefully. Not demanding, waiting. The tallest advisor finally said something softer. The throne has been empty for 5 years. Ben shifted slightly beside the table. That sentence carried weight. Even he could feel it. Sera walked slowly into the room and sat at the table. The advisors followed, standing respectfully. Ben leaned against the counter. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Sera asked quietly, "How bad is it?" The advisor hesitated. The Dominion remains stable. That was not my question. The advisor exhaled slowly. There are factions forming again. Ben muttered under his breath. Of course there are. 3 alien advisors turned toward him again. Ben raised both hands. Sorry, commentary. Sera looked at the advisors again. You want me to return? Yes. And if I refuse? The advisors exchanged another glance. The tallest one spoke carefully. The Dominion would endure. But not well. No. Silence returned to the apartment. Ben watched Sera closely. For 5 years he had known her as the calm woman who laughed at terrible movies and argued about grocery budgets. Now he could see the other side of her, the one they called Queen. Finally, Sera leaned back slightly. You arrived quickly. We departed the moment your location was confirmed. Ben scratched his head. So the giant ship in orbit? Yes. That's yours? Yes. Ben nodded slowly. Just checking. One of the advisors looked around the apartment again. His gaze paused on the coffee machine. What is that device? Ben followed his gaze. That, Ben said, is the hero of this morning. The advisor looked confused. Sera smiled slightly. It produces coffee. The advisor nodded thoughtfully. Impressive. Ben pointed at him. See? Finally someone appreciates it. The apartment remained quiet for a long time after the advisors finished speaking. Even the city outside seemed to slow down. Traffic hummed faintly beyond the windows, and somewhere far above the clouds, the enormous silver vessel waited patiently in orbit. Ben leaned against the kitchen counter, watching Sera. For 5 years, he had seen her sit at that same table while reading news feeds, complaining about grocery prices, or explaining why his attempt to cook soup had accidentally created something that looked like industrial glue. Now 3 advisors from a star empire stood in the same room waiting for her decision. Ben cleared his throat. Okay, he said quietly. No pressure. One of the advisors glanced at him. Ben raised his hands. Just saying, everyone looks very serious. Sera leaned forward slightly and rested her elbows on the table. When I left, she said, the Dominion was collapsing into political chaos. That danger has passed, the tallest advisor replied. For now. Yes. Sera looked at the table. The cracked mug sat beside her hand. Ben noticed her fingers tracing the small fracture along the side of the ceramic. He had bought that mug 3 years ago from a street market because it was cheap and slightly crooked. At the time, he had considered it a poor purchase. Now an interstellar queen was quietly thinking, while touching it like it mattered. Ben spoke carefully. So, hypothetical scenario. Sera looked up. You have many hypothetical scenarios. In this one, Ben said, you go back and rule the galaxy. The Dominion is not the galaxy? You know what I mean? Yes. And everything returns to normal. The advisors nodded slightly, clearly approving of that idea. Ben continued, but normal for you used to mean living in a palace full of politicians who probably argue about everything. That is also accurate. And normal here meant arguing about whose turn it was to do the dishes. Sera looked at the sink. Ben followed her gaze. The dishes were still there. History will remember those dishes, Ben said. One of the advisors tilted his head. Why? Ben shrugged. They've witnessed a lot today. Sera laughed softly. The tension in the room shifted slightly. The advisors relaxed a little. Even they seemed relieved that the atmosphere had become less ceremonial. Finally, Sera stood. She walked slowly toward the window. The afternoon sun reflected faintly off the distant ship high above the planet. For several seconds, she said nothing. Ben watched her carefully. He realized something important in that moment. 5 years ago, Sera had arrived with one suitcase and a carefully chosen lie. Now she stood there with the truth, and it looked much heavier. One of the advisors spoke quietly. The Dominion requires stability. I know. The people still believe in you. Sera nodded. Yes. She turned back toward the room. Her voice was calm again, but different, more certain. I will return. The advisors bowed their heads immediately. Ben exhaled slowly. Well, he said, that sounds important. Sera looked at him. There is more. The advisors looked up again. Sera folded her arms lightly. I will return to the Dominion as queen. That is excellent news, the tallest advisor said. But the Dominion will not be ruled the way it was before? The advisors remained silent. Ben leaned against the counter again. I sense a speech coming. Sera ignored him. For 5 years I lived here, she continued, without ceremony, without political pressure, without people treating every word I say as a royal command. The advisors listened carefully. I learned something important. And that is? The advisor asked. Leadership is not improved by distance. Ben pointed at her. That sentence sounds extremely royal. Sera smiled slightly. The Dominion will remain strong, she said, but I will not rule from behind walls and advisors. The advisors exchanged thoughtful looks. That will require adjustments, one of them said. I know. Then Sera turned toward Ben. And I will not return alone. Ben blinked. I'm sorry. What? You will come with me. The advisors looked surprised. Ben pointed at himself. I fix broken kitchen appliances. You also argue with me honestly. That is because I did not know you were royalty. Exactly. Ben rubbed the back of his neck. You realize I have never ruled a planet before. Most people haven't. I fall over in low gravity. We will install railings. Ben looked at the advisors. They were studying him carefully. Finally, one of them spoke. The Dominion could benefit from unconventional perspective. Ben stared. That might be the most polite way anyone has ever called me unqualified. Sera stepped closer. You gave me 5 years of normal life, she said quietly. Ben shrugged. You paid rent. You also trusted me when I told you almost nothing about my past. Ben thought about that. Then he sighed. Well, he said, yes. I suppose if my roommate turns out to be a queen, following her into space is the logical next step. Sera laughed again. The advisors smiled politely, though Ben suspected they were still trying to understand him. Later that evening, the shuttle lifted quietly from the landing platform. Ben sat beside Sera inside the smooth silver interior. Earth slowly grew smaller beneath them. He looked through the wide viewing window. So, he said, yes? You're going back to rule a 7-system dominion. Yes. And I'm apparently coming with you. Yes. Ben nodded slowly. You know what the strangest part of all this is? What? Ben leaned back in the seat. For 5 years, I thought my life was ordinary. Sera looked out at the stars. It was. Ben watched the vast silver ship waiting above the planet. Next time, he said, maybe warn me before the royal government shows up at breakfast. Sera smiled. I will try. The shuttle connected with the enormous vessel in orbit. Far below, Earth continued its quiet rotation, unaware that somewhere among the stars a queen had finally returned home, accompanied by the only person who had ever treated her like someone ordinary.